very pleased to be part of this program today, and thank you for my introduction, Rajni. I'll begin by introducing Pravin. Pravin Goel is Managing Director and Country Head of BlackRock India. He's a member of India Executive Committee, APAC Executive Committee, and also part of the Human Capital Committee at BlackRock. Pravin has a wide variety of experience working in various geographies like UK, US, India. He has also been responsible for risk management applications as well as capital market trading applications. Pravin started his career in building mobile applications and device drivers, worked at various financial organizations and consulting, and he has been part of BlackRock since 2012. One of the things that we really love about Pravin's session is he's great at building an overall picture about like the industry or business. So why don't I hand it over to Pravin to give us an overall picture of the fintech industry. Over to you, Pravin.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Swarna. Somehow I could not hear you, but thanks for the introduction anyways. And thank you, CFA, for the opportunity to be here with everyone today. I apologize to the audience for not being in person today. Hopefully next time. With that, why don't I get started on the topic today, which is about fintech, with a specific focus on investments, but also overall broad. I wanted to contextualize the conversation on fintech around financial services. Sometimes we get too excited about technology and disruption and so on and forget the overall big picture. So I wanted to start with this picture here. I know most people would understand it anyways, but basically it's simplified, but in the simplified model, I see financial services as four things. Broadly speaking, simplified version, admittedly. On the top left, you see an icon which represents a bank, perhaps the most commonly understood aspect of the financial services ecosystem, especially the retail banks, but also corporate banks and maybe to an extent investment banks. Come back to that in a second as we go around clockwise. The insurance services, which form a key part of the ecosystem. And then on the bottom left, you see investments, which is where I come from. And then all the supporting infrastructure to make all of this happen. So that being the context for fintech, if we now move to next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So under that context, first thing I want to say is the term fintech may be relatively new. It's not that new anymore, but definitely the concept is not. We've been using technology to help financial services for long. Simple things like ATM machines, credit, debit cards, online banking, and so on. So the term may be new, but the concept is not. The thing that's perhaps a little bit new, I think COVID has accelerated. I almost want to say we live in the post-COVID world, but let's just say post the pandemic, we're now moving into a digital first world. And I do think this change is almost permanent, if not permanent. And that acceleration of accepting and expecting everything to be digital first, that expectation has definitely gone through the roof in the last 2 years. On a side note, me doing it in the setting that I'm doing right now from home was probably not as accepted for a conference like this 2 years ago, but no one really raises an eyebrow now. It's pretty common. And then just at a very high level, what's going on that's really making this a much, much bigger theme? I mean, COVID acceleration, like I talked about, but also what's now happening is I think the world is now being taken over by millennials almost. I mean, I guess that applies to a large part of the audience here. Definitely not me, but what that means is as this generation uh, becomes the key client, the key decision makers, and so on. Their lifestyles, their preferences, their way of thinking is going to have a huge implication to everything in the world, including financial services. And two things I chose to highlight here. This is on the green box on top, green box on the right. The ESG. Um, the younger generation, the current generation, is so much more invested, should I say, in the longer term sustainability of not just the businesses, honestly, of our planet and so on. So the ESG focus is huge, which brings an interesting aspect into the fintech thing that we're talking about. I'll touch upon that later. But also digital experience. Maybe this is the first born in the cloud generation, if you will, and that digital experience is not just an add-on; it's a table stake and very much expected, which adds on to the trend on the fintech that I talked about. And then the other two things. This is on the green box bottom right, data and mobile. I think a lot of people are over last many years now have become very comfortable sharing more and more about themselves. So there's a lot of data trail people leave all around the social platform and so on, but also the proliferation of data, the ability for technology to process a lot more data and do all sorts of things with it, data science, etc. I'll touch upon that also, is a key enabler here, which goes hand in hand with the trend on mobile. So those two aspects are kind of driving what we're seeing here. And what I want to do first is maybe break down just a little more on the financial services as the ecosystem, and throw in a few examples just to start bringing this to real life. So if I go back to the top left, banking part of the ecosystem. Clearly, that's about retail banking. Again, most commonly understood part of the ecosystem, which includes savings account, deposits, so on, loans and credit, and payments and credit cards, debit cards, home loans, so on. So that's the retail side, as we all know, and then the corporate banking, which is similar functions, almost the same function as the retail banking, but for the businesses. And then the investment banking, which serves the capital markets purpose, which does the trading function, helps with M&A, helps multinationals and governments and so on. Again, there's an overlap between the investment banking and investment management. I can touch upon that in a bit, but within the square, what I've tried to do is throw in a few examples of what's happening or already happened in the fintech world. So things like Cabbage and the personal loans just makes a whole underwriting much more faster. The whole digital experience that I touched upon is a key aspect of it. And then clearly payments, that's been the biggest thing I mostly done, I would think. But things like Apple Pay, Stripe, Square, you can go on and on. But those things, Paytm here, but those things have been very well established by now, I would think, and I would say. So that on the banking side. And if I move again to the insurance top right part of the ecosystem, again, just very high level, there's one side of it, which is, life insurance, health and accident and so on, that bucket. And then the other more like on the assets, let's say vehicles, buildings and so on. But also others, there's all sorts of things in the others, indemnity and so on, but also agriculture, increasingly, things like cyber security and climate, actually, one of my personal favorites. And in there, what I have mentioned as examples within the square, things like Lemonade. If you don't know Lemonade, you should go check it out. Again, a big part is what I said around the whole digital experience, a chatbot, the speed, and so on. But the other part of it is also aggregation. This is heavily regulated, and what you get is in many ways governed by the regulation. So price point becomes a very important factor. So things like Policy Bazaar, which is mostly playing into the aggregation space. So there you hopefully start to. I mean, I'm guessing most of you anyways know, but just to recap, you hopefully gets to see how it's beginning to come to life. Payments and digital experience on loans and policies and chatbots and speed and so on. And then on the investment side of things, similar to the investment banking or banking side, I guess three main components being institutional, pension funds and actually insurance companies, etc. Also high net worth individual or wealth, but also mass retail. In their examples I've thrown in for institutional is systems like Aladdin. This is a little bit self-serving. Uh, uh, Having worked on that system for many, many years. And then increasingly things like climate tech, again, I touched upon it briefly, both under the context of insurance, but also here. How do you really model what climate risk you're carrying in your portfolios, and how do you really have a path to dealing with it? Is a beautiful application of fintech. That's one of the newer ones, I think. And then within the wealth space, things like mass personalization, unless you were big institutional pension fund, sovereign wealth fund, central bank, etc., you weren't really getting huge personalization on your financial products. But what technology is enabling now is offering that to more and more people. So that's the point of mass personalization. And then on the retail, things like models and robo advisors, it's probably very applicable with what's going on in India right now with the, financialization of our savings, and more people are getting into the markets. More and more people want to know, how do I do really my asset allocation? And sure, different people have different targets and risk appetites, but if there was a two or three or four or five or 10 different models which tweak to your specific requirement, that would be so much better. So that's again a beautiful example of fintech, and then building on that, things like robo advisors. Just quickly moving on to the infrastructure side of things. Again, at a very high level, regulators play in that space, markets infrastructure is in that place, and services like technology providers, data providers, legal services, and so on. And I thought I'll just quickly mention one or two examples of how that space is changing because of fintech. So for the market infrastructure, things like Access Fintech, where if you as one of the providers in the whole market infrastructure, especially let's say asset servicing, you don't necessarily need to upgrade your technology to the latest, let's say Swift or whatever. It's almost an adapter that can come in and your existing infrastructure just works as is. Or things like Sapphire, especially in terms of like customer onboarding. Again, there's a digital experience thing at play here. Or things like Exoni, which is totally changing, or trying to at least changing how the market participants come together. This is an application of blockchain. I'll touch upon that in a little bit. And then maybe it's not on the slide here, but maybe I'll just mention some. You could argue whether that's fintech or not. I think that's actually really beautiful fintech. From regulators, two examples I'd bring is very personal, close to home in India is UPI. I think how that has almost democratized and made it like you could pay for your daily grocery on a roadside vendor through UPI today. So that's like the access is like to the whole population. So that's I think a beautiful example of democratization using technology. And then one of my personal favorites, it's actually brewing pretty hard of the press almost, is ONDC, the Open Network for Digital Commerce, that the government is trying to bring in. And not only does that build beautifully on the whole democratization theme that UPI brought in, like you don't have to be a big tech firm to be able to do digital commerce. ONDC will just open it for everyone to the democratization theme, but also increasingly decentralize it. You don't have to be on a Paytm or another of the big apps to be doing it. You could be doing it anywhere. So um, that's a nice segue. Just in the interest of time, why don't I move to the next slide? It's a nice segue, anyways, to the two key themes I just wanted to quickly touch upon. So next slide, please, which is on democratization and decentralization as almost a truth. If there's like super simplifying what's going on in fintech and what opportunities it's opening up, how you could think about the skills and careers and all of that. If I was to somehow try and distill that to two words, I would call them as decentralization and democratization. Maybe I'll start with decentralization first. The decentralization, what's happening there, this is the green box at the bottom, um, is what technology is enabling is a move from mass production, which is really the ethos of the industrial revolution, the mass production. We're now moving from mass production to mass personalization. Again, I touched upon that in the context of wealth a little bit, and if there's time later today, Swarna will touch upon that too. But also things like consumer segmentation, which has always existed. Marketing is always tried to know what different segments of consumers it's trying to serve, and email campaigns and all of that has been very segmented for long. But what's now happening because of technology and on the theme of democratization is the change or the customization of the product or the service itself, not just the segmentation of the consumers. And like I touched upon, the stuff that used to be available only for the ultra wealthy, meaning in terms of customization and personalization, is now moving to the masses. This builds upon the theme I said upon people are sharing a lot about themselves on social media and so on, and that can be clubbed with the cloud technologies to one, move to the masses, but also the next thing that I have there, which is the trend is, instead of the product or services being available when they're available, the trend is to make them available when needed. Now, this is a beautiful application of the data analytics and so on. The so-called, I would call the micro moments. The funny story being, Facebook probably knows more about your family members than you do. So based on the data you've been sharing, they just suddenly show you what you really need, when you need it, the form you need it, and so on. So that's the democratization aspect. And just to bring this to life through an example, imagine what Spotify would look like if you couldn't create your own personal list, your own personal playlist. So the power of making it more customizable. I have an asterisk, it's probably not readable on the first one on mass personalization to mass customization to totally bespoke tailor made. That power is super huge. And how it's showing up, especially in things like investments, is things like direct indexing. Where it could be optimized for your tax liabilities and so on. But also, as more and more people want the purpose of their wealth to be articulated, shown, incorporated into their investment thesis, that is possible through the mass personalization, democratization that I touched upon. ESG is part of it. I guess one thing I really want to point out before I move on from here is building trust is key. I think if people, whether in the wealth segment, consumer or mass retail or institutional, if people start losing trust on how their data is being used, if these super customized product recommendations start feeling creepy and people feel like their personal information is not being misused, this won't work. So the point of, we can do whatever we want to do with technology. Ultimately, it boils down to being human and building trust, and that's very important. Moving to the other theme, which is democratization on the top left green box, there's three main things in there that are going on, I think. One is just the store of value is being questioned. And if pandemic was the accelerator to the digital adoption, in many ways, the current war is the accelerator to question the, what is the reserve currency, and what should be the store of value, and so on. So the crypto or whatever, it can be an asset in and of itself, but also the other thing being tokenization of assets, and finally enterprise applications. If there's time, we can touch upon some of the details. But I think what I have there is the path to centralization, path to decentralization may go through centralization. I think that's the whether that's in the term in the spirit of stable coins, whether that's in the spirit of centralized, decentralized exchange, like what Coinbase and others are trying to do. I feel the path to decentralization may have to be through centralization. We can touch upon it a little more, but why don't I expand a little more on the decentralization, distributed finance a little bit. And if there is time at the end, Swarna can touch upon the mass personalization. So if you move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so trying to talk about blockchain and decentralization and distributed finance and bring that to life and what it could mean. The picture credits is for this beautiful book called Mirror of India. It's not my own picture. I love this picture. And the reason I brought that up is at the end of the day, it's good old ledger. I mean, sometimes you get super bothered about, I really don't understand blockchain or this, that, or the other. What this guy is doing is probably checking proof of work right now or doing double entry work. At the end of the day, it's like, it's a good old ledger. But that being said, it can hugely change our world. So I'll try and bring that to life through next 3 or 4 points. The first one is decentralized autonomous organization, so-called DAOs. Imagine there is this organization, this company, which has no employees. Everything is code. Everything that needs to happen is somehow coded, so there are no employees. And they're only shareholders. And all shareholders have tokens, which is their ways of saying how much vote they have in what goes on in the firm, what goes on in this autonomous organization. The source code for the organization is open source. Everyone can see what the organization is about. Talk about radical transparency. Can the organization improve? Yes, the improvement in the organization is also suggested code changes. Anyone in the world can suggest a code change so the DAO can get better, and then the shareholders vote on which code changes have to be adopted, and that leads to the new form of the organization, the new DAO. And by the way, unlike the current organizations, the government can shut it down when it wants to. The government will also need to go through acquiring enough votes to be able to vote for the changes they want. There's no shortcut for anyone. So extreme example of decentralization, almost like the whole firm without any employees. That's DAO. That's what blockchain also enables. The other thing, which is probably much more commonly talked about, is smart contracts. Again, it's all about the code. These smart contracts are also code, which codify the terms and conditions of any transaction that is agreed by buyers and sellers. And what I find fascinating is these are self-executing contracts. If the terms and conditions are met, the transaction happens. So those are smart contracts. And then there is oracles. The concept of oracles being, these are the connection of the blockchain to the real world. Whatever is going on in the real world is connected. So for example, if a smart contract is based on a temperature in a city, what is the temperature in a city at that time is not in blockchain. It has to go to the real world, get that temperature, without compromising the sanctity of the blockchain, which is what the notion of oracles is. And if you thought what I'm talking about is from a sci-fi movie many, many years away or whatever, I just thought I'll bring up this example. You could Google if you don't know about them. Is Lemonade recently announced Lemonade Climate Coalition. This is to provide climate insurance to smallholder farms, especially to begin with in Africa, which is subject to severe climate changes. You could argue it's, even in India, but in that coalition, the DAO stack, which is the firm or organization trying to push forward for DAO, is part of it. Avalanche, which is trying to do the ledger in a green way, is part of it. Chainlink, which is the leading player in the Oracle space, is part of it. It's full of smart contracts given to these farmers. They don't have to put in policy or whatever. It's at cost made available to them, and the oracles do the claims for themselves. So it's actually happening right now. With that, why don't we move to the next slide, please? So just wanting to switch from that to, okay, so the world is changing. You have some fascinating examples, some really settled down places, but some really big changes that are probably coming. So what does it really mean in terms of the opportunities and careers and roles and skills? That's the thing that I want to bring to life, hopefully in the next 5-10 minutes, maybe 15, and then hand over for Q&A or wealth conversation. But basically 3 or 4 things I want to say is, what do you have to do to make use of the opportunities that are coming in next 5, 10, 15 years? I would say the number one thing that I say is understand technology, especially deep learning. Deep learning will change almost everything, is changing maybe almost everything. The picture on the left is of a camouflage tank. That reminds me of a story that I should quickly talk about, why it's important to understand the big picture of deep learning. In case some of you may know the story, so I apologize if it's repetition, but US Army was trying to build an artificial intelligence model to try and apply computer vision to see if there were tanks hiding camouflaged away. And they gave a tank to the data scientists. They drove the tank around in the countryside, took many pictures, created whatever data they needed, came up with this model that worked beautifully in the lab to try and see where a tank may be hiding. When it was given to the army, it was a disaster. It just totally failed. And and one of the leaders in the army understood AI a little bit, and when he spoke to the AI modeling team, he could understand what they'd built is what was going on is when they were building this model, these tanks were, all the pictures that they'd taken were on a sunny day. And most of the use case in the real world, in the forest or whatever, there wasn't enough sunlight. So the model has really learned how to see whether it was sunny or not, and based on whether it was sunny or not, it was trying to predict whether there was a tank or not. So instead of learning how to see a tank, it had learned how to see sun. But the reason it could be debugged and so on is because the users understood technology at a high level. So the picture on the right is a very commonly used example of what's known as class activation maps on what is the computer really seeing when it's learning that model. These examples are more on the interpretation. In the data science world, they're used more for the interpretability of the model. But I hope you understand what I'm trying to say is it's important to understand how it works. You don't have to be a coder, you don't have to be a data scientist, but you have to understand how it works. So, which is a nice segue to the next point, which is focus on the big picture. You don't have to be stuck into the minutia of everything. In fact, cross-functional is a thing. CFA probably calls it the T model or T shape or skills or whatever. But especially what's happened in the last 2 years of working from home and isolation, people have gotten so isolated about doing their thing and the real value is on the cross-functional, cross-disciplinary, and it's a skill that people should build. And then the third thing I want to say is the opportunity set is huge. So on one hand, you should understand and focus on the big picture, but on the other hand, also focus on building some specific SME. Again, going back to that T model, the vertical line being deep and the horizontal line being big picture. And on that note, just for example, you could pick Ethereum and Avalanche, which are also blockchains or blockchain providers. They use Solidity as a programming language for coding smart contract. Hyperledger uses JavaScript. Corda hadn't introduced smart contracts in a big way recently, but uses Kotlin, which Google is trying to do more and more of, and reduce dependency on Java. Corda is struggling a little bit on performance right now, but that's besides the point. Pick what works for you. And then the other thing is digital experience, like I said, is very important. So whether being full stack developer or how UX works and so on. So that's on the tech side, but more importantly, I would say double down on being human. Next slide, please. Magic of being human. This is a hand-drawn image of a ring. I don't know if it looks like a ring. I hope it does. And I'm gonna tell a very quick short story on a magic ring. There was this person who had this uncle who lived in, let's say, United States. Probably relates to some of us. And whenever this person's uncle would come home, will bring him a gift, and the uncle asked him what would he like next time, and he said, "Get me a magic ring." And what's the magic ring about? The magic ring is it answers whatever you ask. You can ask anything in the world; it should tell me what the answer is. And I thought I'll start like, wouldn't it be great to have such a thing which just tells you everything? And I want to say, what if I was to tell you we all have that right now, right here? And that's our brains, that's our minds, the combination of our consciousness and our intelligence. Let's me just call it brain. It's super hardwired to always answer. You just have to know how to ask the question. You will get the answer. Even if the answer is, I don't know, the right follow-up question is, how can I find out? And then you'd say, okay, go Google or whatever. So the magic of being human is about being curious and asking a lot of questions. And a lot of human skills are the real thing. Next slide, please. And let me just try and bring that on the human side. So this is the picture of our brain. Again, probably not very clear. Also kind of put on that ring to the point of you all have it and we all have it now. But the point of what I'm trying to say is, I used to say, I remember being in a similar conference of 3 years ago, maybe 3.5 years ago, saying we live in a VUCA world. Little did we all know what was about to happen 2020 onwards. And it's so super volatile now and so uncertain and all of that. It is natural to feel stressed about what's going on, and especially about the uncertainty out in the world. Just a quick note on neuroscience. Hint, hint. I'm trying to say learning neuroscience is a useful skill to learn. Our kidneys produce cortisols, which are received in our brain by hypothalamus, and that's going to keep happening. There's too much disruption coming. By the way, more should be exciting to my previous slide on the Hyperledger and the solutions there. But what is the human solution? What are the skills we need to build? I would say faith, in the ability to trust yourself, and especially, for the audience here, you're much, much younger than I am. Just, youth is your superpower. Adaptability and agility comes much more naturally to you. But also ethics. I know CFA is a big, big proponent of that. I know Amit, I don't know if Amit is in the audience, but he's a big, big proponent of that. Resilience, it's not about whether we fall down or get up. It's not about whether we get COVID or not. It's about can we get up and get going and so on. But perhaps most importantly, even within the technology world, I said the most important thing is to build trust. So I would say the most important thing, the most important skill is to learn how to build trust. So next slide, please. So I don't know if you can read this. This is a slide I've reused from a previous session I'd done for CFA interns. So apologies for the reuse, but I thought a lot of that is still very applicable. So just maybe a minute on the neuroscience again. On the left-hand side, there's a single molecule, chemically speaking, there's a single molecule that is responsible for building trust. It's called oxytocin. It is produced in your heart, like cortisols are produced in your kidneys. I won't talk about the trust gains here in the trust factor in the interest of time. But let's talk about what are the skills to do, which is on the right-hand side here. Clear communications, maybe just say soft skills. You can't not take responsibility for your communication. Communication is what the listener does. So many times we think because I've spoken, I've communicated. If you're not listening right now, if you're not understanding what I'm saying, communication is not happening. Our world, especially in the context of fintech or tech in general, has become so convenient for the speaker. It's such an easy thing for me to be sending an email that may not be well understood by the receiver. And I think I've done the communication, but the real trick is communication is what the listener does. Being on time, if you take one thing away from this on the skill to build, it will be that. Do what you say and say what you do. We at the firm are very big on that. Again, a reference back to ethics as one of the most important skills. In the future world, my personal pandemic gift is the awareness on mental health and the importance of mental health. I would say how you prioritize, how you learn that skill on managing your stress and being at the peak mental health is a very important skill. Oxytocin is not friends with cortisol. And build relationships. In here, I want to say, last 2 years, it's worked okay working from home, and there's beautiful benefits of working from home. You can be in your pajamas, you don't have to spend time commuting, blah 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 blah. But one thing I want to say is, please remember, all careers. There is no exception to this. If you're sat out in the audience, you think you're an exception. I want you to reconsider. There are no exceptions. All careers are about results and relationships, about outcomes and tasks and ability to influence their relationships. When we're talking about it's working from home, we forget that we were in survival mode. Everyone was working from home, and now some people are not, and we're not in survival mode. The relationships, both the quality and the quantity of relationships you build remotely aren't as great. So don't work 100% remote unless you have a really strong reason to. And then the last thing I'm going to say is think of your career as a portfolio of experiences. I have to talk about investment management analogy. Don't think of it as a ladder that you have to go up and up and up. Think of it as a lattice which has diversity of experiences. So there you have it. A few trends on what's really driving fintech, especially democratization and decentralization. How do you make use of the opportunities it opens up, especially on learning tech, but also doubling down on being human. But with that, why don't I hand over to Swarna, who can do a little bit of maybe a 5-minute version on wealth tech. She leads wealth tech for us before we open it up for Q&A.
Thank you, Pravin. So while I talk about fintech, if you have any questions for Pravin, please start posting on the application. As Pravin mentioned, I am at BlackRock, part of the Aladdin Wealth Tech division, where we build technology solutions for advisors and home office users. We build it for other wealth management firms as well. So what are the trends that we are seeing in the wealth management industry in past 2 years? There have been a shift in the way we did wealth management since the pandemic has started. The 3 things that I want to talk about, the first one is personalization. Pravin touched upon it. So more and more clients are becoming aware of where they want to invest their money into. For example, a certain client would not want to invest in something which has tobacco as part of the portfolio. So we are not, using cookie cutter kind of things. That's the same portfolio solution works for everybody. So this is the trend which focuses on personalization, and therefore technology plays a key role in allowing mass personalization for a large number of clients. The next trend that I want to talk about is digitalization. As has happened in all the other industries as well with work from home, more and more interaction is happening online. And that is similar in wealth management space as well. The financial advisor no more meets the client every time. They are going to, share like a proposal, which is a digital proposal. The client will be able to log into an application and see their portfolio and its associated risks. So it has to be presented in a way that the client understands, who is probably not from a financial background. So we are seeing a lot of trends in building great front-end applications where the data is presented in a way that the client understands. The last part that I want to talk about is that the nature of financial advisor's job. Like few years ago, the financial advisor is not just going to give the advice, they'll probably also do the portfolio construction and various other things for the client. Now, with the shift in consumer behavior, what we are seeing is the job of financial advisor is now focused on providing a wholesome financial planning advice to the user. But the other phase is, for example, portfolio construction, for example, reporting, creating the proposal, everything is now technology driven. So the technology solutions, while they have to be built in a way that they are able to solve the problem, but the job of financial advisor is just to convince the client on or provide the tools to the client so that they understand their portfolios and requirements. So a lot of work is being done in technology around these areas. With that, why don't I open the forum for any questions you might have for Pravin or me? Somebody asked, I think, on which platforms. Sorry, can you pass the mic? Yeah. Is there a mic?
Hi. Firstly, I just want to thank Mr. Goel for covering so much in detail in such a short period of time. I particularly enjoyed the magic of being human part of this. And my question to you is on DAOs. So, they say that people are smart, but a crowd is dumb. So with a community-led driven governance system, what do you think the implications of this would be in terms of managing stakeholder interests?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And thank you for your kind words on the human side. Listen, it's debatable on whether crowds are dumb. In many ways, even as humans, our real intelligence is collective intelligence. I mean, that's the whole point of diversity and inclusion, and having people with different diversities, diverse experiences, and bringing them together. The point of inclusion in together. So DAOs are probably the last ones to fully take off. I personally think organizations won't be all about code. There will be people in the organizations. But just more directly to your question, even in the form that we're imagining DAOs, the shareholders actually decide and vote on what changes, how they want the the DAO to run. It still is human, and you could easily argue, actually, and if we get this right, it will be a beautiful, almost a utopia for humanity. The organization's code, like the like literally and figuratively, the code for the organization is available to everyone in the world. So it is actually hyper intelligent in the sense that the whole world can contribute to making this more intelligent and smarter. Last part I would add, maybe use this question as an opportunity to add as a context, is I would urge everyone to be a tech optimist. I think I think there's a real danger now that people start freaking out on what's happening. Like, how do we save humanity? How do we save sense? We're going to a dumb machine running the world. I think the world, in my view, is going to be still run by humans, augmented by machines, and and humans have been smart. We built cars, we built machines, but we were not smart enough. We built these things and destroyed the planet. If we were smart enough, which I hope we will, as the machines augment our intelligence, we'll build smarter solutions. So I would urge everyone to be a tech optimist, and under that context, I think even if the full DAO thing became the only way the organizations are run, even then, the humans in terms of shareholders, the human in terms of everyone in the world looking at what's going on in the firm and contributing meaningfully to that will perhaps be utopian, actually.
Okay, thanks. So you have a very optimistic outlook on this.
Okay, thank you. So I have one question on the application here, Pravin. How does fintech plan to increase the penetration of financial products and services to tier 1 and tier 2 cities? Pravin, can you hear my question? I think screen has frozen. Let me try by answering this question while Pravin comes back. So, I think he's got disconnected. Okay. So, as you are aware, like during the pandemic, even in the villages, people have internet and like mobile phones, smartphones. So, I think as more and more applications are built for products, for example, Policy Bazaar, or for example, internet banking applications are available. I think first part is like having those applications, and then second part is educating the people in tier 1 or tier 2 cities for them to be able to be aware that these are the products or services that are available that they can use, given they have data as well as mobile. So I think these are the two ways in which the fintech industry is going to be able to provide these services to tier 1 and tier 2 cities. I don't think we lost Pravin, so can we check with? Okay. Sure.
Hi, this is Piyush. He's not there, so the question will be addressed to you.
Sure.
Few years back, even now, it's being touted that data is the new oil, right?
Correct.
Of course, but for oil, there were barriers to entry. It was high capital intensive, right? Data, even the security guard has my phone number. So data is available everywhere. Data democratization has not created any barriers to entry for anybody to come and play. How is it that this data is to be mined to make as much more money by finance professionals in the fintech space? Because anybody here, like we have hundreds of us here, if we learned code, we could have our app. So that was my question.
So I'll try, and let's see if Pravin is able to join and answer as well. But my answer to your question
I
is...
am back.
Thank you, Pravin. So do you want to ask that question again? And what's your good name, if you could announce your name before you ask?
No, I heard the question. I heard the question.
Okay. Thank you, Pravin. Yeah, take.
Okay, sure. I can take a stab at it, Swarna, if you and you could add if you want it. I think it's an interesting play on whether the barriers are coming down or going up. On one hand, I totally agree the barriers are coming down. That's the whole point of democratization. That's the whole point of if you wanted to start a startup today, it's so much easier with cloud and all of that than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. That being said, actually the contradiction almost in that whole thing is, the data is actually not as easily available as it sounded like in your question. Like clean data isn't as easily available. Relevant data isn't as easy. For example, as you look at the ESG side of things, the biggest barrier is data. Sure, like you said, anyone with with a little bit of a technology background can create a model architecture, and that model architecture can learn on itself. But to be able to provide, for example, satellite data, like who has access to that right now? If you were to look at, let's say, if you wanted to build a climate risk technology based on satellite data, it's not as easily available to everyone today. Governments still control that for security, et cetera, reasons to a large extent. Of course, it's opening up. So, short answer, you're right. The barriers are coming down, which should be a good thing. Young people like yourself should be able to start startups easier than ever before. But data isn't as easily available as you said. The big part of machine learning and artificial intelligence is access to huge clean data, not ability to code a model architecture.
Thank you, Praveen. And it's a good segue in the next question. Um, we talked about that we need to look at the broader picture when it comes to technology. How should a guy with non-tech background understand technologies used in fintech? This is a question from Bhavpreet.
Sir, please repeat the
Sure.
question.
We talked about that we need to look at broad picture when it comes to technology. How should a person from non-technical background understand technologies used in fintech?
Sure. I, I don't know if it's any different from any other thing about really focusing on the concepts much more than the syntax or the nitty gritty. If you, for example, what's a good example? If you, for example, understood the point of oracles, like I just talked about, is to bring in that specific data point from the real world at a given point in time, then when you're looking at a solution design, you could make sense of what the Oracle is trying to do versus, for example, knowing how to code that in Chainlink, which is getting into the details. So focusing on the big picture is focusing on the concepts and how the concepts come together. That's the mindset. And then on how to, there are all sorts of ways. I mean, depends on you. There are books, for example, there's this book called Technology for Non-Technologists. I forget the name of the author. If needed, I can share that offline. This is an Indian guy from Stanford. A beautiful, it's a beautiful description of like how do you apply different technologies to business. There are all sorts of courses on Coursera, Udemy, but perhaps most importantly, I think you talk to the practitioners. The conversations like what we're having today probably take you, 10 times further ahead in 1/10 of the time. So talking about following right people on Twitter, but most importantly, meeting people in person.
Thank you, Praveen. And I think we are at time of our hour, so I would like to thank all of you for your time and listening to us and for your questions. With that, we conclude our session. Thank you, Praveen.